All right, I just want to go over a couple minor points with a PowerPoint that I either did do or was going to do in class. So we kind of left off with the end of World War One. We talked about how the U.S. had mobilized for war because the U-boats attacking Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram, and we looked at how World War One ended officially with the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles with Germany and the Treaty of Sèvres with the Ottoman Empire coming out of the end of World War One. But there was a lot that happened during World War One and during this peacetime process as well. So I want to talk about that a little bit, specifically within the Middle East. Now, John Green calls this the era of competing nationalisms. If you remember the definition of nationalism, it's pride in your country. And when it's extreme, it can actually be pretty dangerous because people are willing to do really crazy things, extreme things, to defend their country. Well, I want to kind of expand that term country or nation to your heritage or your cultural identity. So we're going to take a look at two specific groups, the Arabs and the Jews, and how they both had nationalism, but they didn't have any land yet. They didn't have a nation. Now we're going to take a look at how they attempted to get a nation, but this term, competing nationalisms, is really going to take the lead with this conversation. So just a quick background. The Ottoman Empire was in control of most of the modern-day Middle East before World War One. They were very tolerant of the different people within their groups, different groups within their territory. There was a section for the Jews, a section for the Arabs, a section for the Kurds, a section for the Turks, a section for the Armenians, and they all almost had their own little neighborhoods. And the Ottoman Empire kind of traded the ability to practice your own religion in exchange for them staying in power. That's how they kept their empire together. They allowed people just enough freedom so that they were happy and not revolting against the Ottoman Empire. Now, after World War I, the Treaty of Sèvres completely weakens the Ottoman Empire to the point where these different groups have basically two choices to try to get their own nation. They can either fight for it, and usually that meant taking up arms against the European power that was in control of their territory, which usually did not end well, or they could lobby and ask the European powers for independence. So we're going to take a look at how that happens with the Arabs and the Jews. First, with the Jews. Zionism is a term that we hear a lot during this time period. Zionism is a very specific form of nationalism for the Jews. It's the belief that there should be a homeland in Palestine, specifically for the Jewish people. Now, Palestine was the original homeland of the Jews, so it makes sense that they would want to go back to their original homeland. They were kicked out in the first century by the Romans, and ever since then they've been kind of dispersed among the world population without really having a home of their own. So in the late 1800s, this idea of Zionism really started to form, and by the end of World War II, there's this huge push for Zionism to become a reality, especially after the horrors of the Holocaust are revealed. But in 1917, not to get too far ahead in the timeline, in 1917, Zionism made a huge victory in the Balfour Declaration. A.J. Balfour was a British official in the British government, and he wrote a letter to the Zionist leaders saying that the British government supported Zionism. And that was awesome. The Zionists were so excited about that, especially as the war dragged on into 1918 and the Paris Peace Conference happened in 1919. The British supporting Zionism was a big deal. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was made during the war between the British and the French, said that the British would control the area of Palestine after the war. And so that carried into the Paris Peace Conference. Coming out of the Treaty of Sèvres, it was clear that the British were going to have authority over a large chunk of Palestine. So the fact that they said that they agreed with Zionism, that they would give the Jews a homeland there, was a big deal. It was like a drop in the bucket that was going to happen. But, as we'll see in a little bit with the Arabs, they promised the same land to another group of people. This is where things start to get a little sticky. During World War I, the British underestimated the Ottoman Empire, hugely underestimated them. The Ottoman Empire was nicknamed the sick man of Europe. Nobody really expected them to put up a fight, but they were actually really good fighters. And the British were losing a lot of these battles in 1914, 1915. They realized they had to change their strategy, and they ended up calling on this guy T. Lawrence to do them a favor. Now, T. Lawrence also worked in the British government in the Foreign Office, and he had actually grown up in the Middle East. He was friends with them. He had dressed like them. He understood their language and their culture. And so they asked him to go to the Arab leaders and help them plan a revolt against the Ottoman Empire, an uprising. That way, the Ottomans had to focus on what was going on in their own nation, and a little less resources, supplies, and troops would be sent to the front with the British. So the British would be able to essentially win World War I with the Ottomans being distracted with their own rebellion. That was the plan. Now, in exchange for rebelling against the Ottoman Empire, the Brits promised that they would give an Arab state, or at least land for an Arab state, to those Arab leaders. Because the British won the war, because the Ottoman Empire was defeated, and according to the Treaty of Sèvres, the British would control that area. The Arabs expected literally to have a piece of paper, a map, with their Arab state on it at the end of the war. But according to the Treaty of Sèvres, the British got control of that territory. The Jews did not get that territory. The Arabs did not get that territory. The British and the French did. They were the ones who controlled the Middle East either through mandates or spheres of influence, different types of imperialism, and they did not give freedom to those different groups. So those are two examples of how the British had essentially broken their promises to both the Arabs with the Arab Revolt and the Balfour Declaration to the Jews. So after World War I and into this post-World War I era, into the 1920s, nobody is happy. The Arabs will end up kind of almost controlling a nation that is nowhere near the size or location that they want. They still are overseen by the British and the French. The Jews start traveling to Palestine. They buy land. They start to organize their schools, their healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. But the British are still there. They're still in control of it. And when the Arabs and the Jews end up quarreling, and we see some of these uprisings because the Arabs don't like the idea of the Jews having control of Palestine, the British restrict immigration to Palestine. So things are not going very well for the Jews during this time period either. And the British and the French, even though they're controlling the area through mandates or spheres of influence, they're mostly there for trade, for access to trade, and the oil. But they very, very, very quickly realize that these are two gigantic problems that they're going to have to handle. And mostly the British, because they control Palestine, because they control the territory that the Arabs won, they're going to end up having to sort out this dispute because they did promise the same land to two different people. So that's a little bit about the in-between era and what's going on in the Middle East after World War I. You should be able to fill out the study guide based on some of this information. But if you have any questions, make sure you come see me.